Oprah Winfrey bowed her head in silent prayer as Detective James Sullivan placed the handcuffs around her wrists outside the Holy Trinity Baptist Church in Atlanta, completely unaware that America's most trusted media personality had been secretly working for the past 34 months to expose the largest religious fraud conspiracy in American history. A criminal empire that had stolen over $1.2 billion from faithful Christians across the nation who believed they were donating to God's work but were actually funding the luxurious lifestyles of fake preachers and corrupt televangelists. The Sunday morning sun cast long shadows across the church parking lot as news cameras captured what appeared to be the ultimate betrayal of Christian trust. But what Detective Sullivan and the assembled congregation didn't know was that every suspicious financial transaction he had traced to Oprah's foundation was actually part of the most comprehensive private investigation ever conducted into religious fraud, an investigation that would ultimately save the faith and finances of over 3.7 million American Christians who had been systematically deceived by wolves in sheep's clothing. Ms. Winfrey, Detective Sullivan announced with the moral indignation of someone who believed he was defending the faithful from celebrity exploitation, "You're under arrest for grand larceny of church funds, conspiracy to defraud religious organizations, and wire fraud involving the systematic theft of donations intended for Christian ministries across 23 states." The congregation gasped in shock as their beloved Oprah, who had spoken so often about her faith and spiritual journey, stood accused of betraying the very communities that had supported her throughout her career. What they couldn't see was the quiet determination in her eyes, the same expression she had worn during every major challenge in her life. The look of someone who knew that sometimes protecting what you love most requires sacrificing everything you've built. The charges against Oprah were devastating in their scope, and particularly heartbreaking because they struck at the foundation of everything she had publicly stood for throughout her career. According to the federal indictment that Detective Sullivan had spent 22 months building, Oprah had been operating a sophisticated scheme to siphon money from church donations and Christian charitable organizations, using her spiritual reputation to convince faithful Americans to redirect their religious giving through her foundation, then keeping the money for personal use instead of forwarding it to legitimate ministries. The evidence appeared overwhelming. Financial records showing $89.7 million in suspicious religious donations, testimony from church leaders claiming their expected contributions had never arrived, and expert analysis suggesting systematic exploitation of Christian generosity. But the real story had begun 2 years and 10 months earlier, on a quiet Wednesday evening when Oprah received a phone call that would fundamentally change her understanding of how faith-based fraud was destroying the spiritual and financial lives of millions of American Christians. The call came from Pastor Margaret Thompson, a 71-year-old Methodist minister from rural Tennessee whose small congregation had donated their entire building fund, $127,000 raised over 8 years through bake sales, potluck dinners, and faithful tithing, to what they believed was a Christian television ministry that promised to build churches in impoverished communities around the world. Before we reveal how Oprah's investigation exposes this massive religious fraud empire, make sure you hit that subscribe button and notification bell, because what happens next will shock you about how fake preachers are stealing from faithful Christians, and we've got more incredible investigations coming your way. For most celebrities, such a call would have been forwarded to a publicist or charitable foundation and forgotten. But Oprah had built her entire career on the principle that everyone's story mattered, and Pastor Thompson's account of systematic religious deception struck at everything she believed about protecting faith and honoring the sacrificial giving of ordinary Christians. According to statistics from the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, religious fraud affects approximately 2.8 million American Christians annually, with elderly churchgoers representing 67% of all victims due to their deep trust in religious authority figures and their commitment to supporting what they believe are legitimate Christian ministries. Oprah's investigation began with resources that reflected both her substantial wealth and her deep personal commitment to protecting the faith community that had supported her throughout her spiritual journey. She hired Sacred Trust Investigations, a specialized firm that focused exclusively on religious fraud and faith-based financial crimes. The firm's director, former FBI Religious Crimes Unit investigator David Martinez, had spent 18 years tracking religious fraud and understood exactly how sophisticated criminal organizations exploited Christian generosity and biblical teachings about giving to steal from faithful Americans who trusted that their donations were supporting God's work. What Martinez discovered in his preliminary investigation exceeded even Oprah's worst fears about the vulnerability of America's faith community. The scheme wasn't just targeting individual churches through random solicitations or fake mission appeals. It was a systematic infiltration of Christian television, radio ministry, and even legitimate denominations, involving corrupt religious leaders who were selling access to church mailing lists, congregation financial information, and even the ability to impersonate established ministries to redirect donations to accounts controlled by criminal organizations disguised as religious enterprises. The financial complexity of the religious fraud empire was staggering beyond imagination. Martinez's team discovered that the criminal organization had generated over $1.2 billion in stolen religious donations over the past 7 years, using a combination of fake television ministries, counterfeit missionary organizations, and systematic manipulation of Christian media to steal from faithful Americans who often didn't realize their donations had been misdirected until they contacted the legitimate ministries they thought they were supporting and learned that no record of their giving existed. But what made this religious fraud scheme particularly heartbreaking was its systematic targeting of elderly Christians who represented what criminals recognized as the most generous and trusting segment of the American population. According to research by the Better Business Bureau's Wise Giving Alliance, religious donors over the age of 65 contribute 78% of all charitable giving to faith-based organizations, making them primary targets for criminals who understood that elderly Christians were most likely to trust religious appeals and least likely to verify the legitimacy of ministries that claimed to be doing God's work in desperate communities around the world. The psychological profile that emerged of the religious fraud network's leadership was deeply disturbing to anyone who understood the sacred trust that exists between legitimate ministers and faithful congregations. According to studies by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, criminals who specialize in religious fraud often justify their actions by claiming they are more deserving of donations than the legitimate ministries they impersonate, or by convincing themselves that faithful Christians are somehow naive or foolish for trusting religious appeals without conducting extensive background investigations. Working with Martinez's team, Oprah began documenting the religious fraud network using methods that combined her natural spiritual sensitivity with her substantial resources to fund an investigation that traditional law enforcement agencies couldn't match due to the complex legal protections surrounding religious organizations. She personally visited over 200 churches across 15 states, spending time with pastors and congregations to understand how religious fraud was affecting real faith communities and carefully documenting the specific techniques that criminals were using to exploit Christian generosity and biblical teachings about sacrificial giving. The breakthrough in Oprah's investigation came when Martinez's team identified Reverend Patricia Williams, a 20-year television ministry employee who had been recruited by the fraud network but was clearly struggling with the moral and spiritual implications of her participation in stealing from faithful Christians. Williams fit the profile of what religious fraud investigators call a conflicted insider, someone who becomes involved in religious crime through financial pressure or career manipulation, but maintains enough spiritual awareness to potentially become a whistleblower if approached correctly and offered appropriate spiritual and legal support. According to research by the International Association of Christian Financial Counselors, religious organization employees who become involved in fraud often do so because of personal financial crises, family emergencies, or systematic pressure from criminal organizations that identify and exploit vulnerable workers within Christian ministries. Oprah's team spent 9 months carefully approaching Williams, using techniques developed by religious fraud investigators for recruiting informants within corrupted faith organizations while ensuring her spiritual counseling and legal protection throughout the process. It took nearly 11 months of patient spiritual guidance and practical support, but Williams finally agreed to provide inside information about the fraud network's operations within the Christian television and radio industry. What she revealed was a systematic betrayal of Christian trust that extended far beyond simple theft. It was a coordinated effort to exploit the biblical principle of generous giving that millions of American Christians considered central to their faith, turning the very scriptures and spiritual teachings designed to honor God into weapons for financial exploitation of faithful believers. The evidence Williams provided was comprehensive and spiritually devastating in its implications for America's Christian community. Audio recordings of fraud coordinators laughing about the gullibility of faithful Christians while discussing which churches to target based on their financial capacity and spiritual devotion, financial records showing how stolen religious donations were distributed among fake ministers and criminal organizations, and detailed documentation of how the network systematically identified elderly Christians who were most likely to trust religious appeals and donate substantial portions of their fixed incomes to what they believed were legitimate ministry opportunities. Working with Williams as an inside source, Oprah's investigation team began mapping the full scope of the religious fraud network's operations across multiple denominational boundaries and media platforms. They discovered that the scheme involved not just television evangelists and radio ministers, but corrupt workers in legitimate denominational headquarters, Christian publishing companies, and even some established churches whose leadership had been compromised or completely replaced by criminals who understood how to exploit religious language and biblical references to steal from faithful congregations. According to analysis by the North American Mission Board's Fraud Prevention Unit, Coordinated religious fraud schemes typically require 24 to 48 months to establish full operational control over targeted faith communities, but this network had been operating for over 8 years. The sophistication of their operations had enabled them to steal from Christian Americans with virtually no detection, systematically targeting faithful believers who were most likely to trust religious authority figures and least likely to question appeals that claimed biblical support for their charitable requests. The spiritual and financial impact of the fraud scheme was devastating beyond measure for Christian families and congregations across America. Oprah's investigation documented cases of elderly Christians who had donated their life savings to fake missionary organizations and were living in poverty while believing they had supported God's work, churches that had mortgaged their buildings to support fraudulent ministries and faced foreclosure when the promised matching donations never materialized, and families who had sacrificed basic necessities to support what they believed were legitimate Christian causes, only to discover that their faithfulness had been exploited by criminals who mocked their devotion. But Oprah's investigation also revealed how the fraud network had been specifically targeting her own spiritual journey and public faith testimony, using her reputation for spiritual seeking and religious openness to identify Christians who might be susceptible to ministry appeals that claimed to be endorsed by celebrities they admired for their spiritual authenticity. Over the past 2 years, the network had used Oprah's name and spiritual quotes without permission to promote fraudulent religious organizations, deliberately exploiting the trust that Christian Americans felt toward her spiritual journey to steal their faithful donations. The personal targeting of Oprah's spiritual reputation was systematic and sophisticated, involving fake websites that claimed to offer Oprah's favorite Christian ministries, recorded phone calls that used manipulated audio to suggest Oprah was personally endorsing fraudulent religious organizations, and even fake television advertisements that appeared to show Oprah promoting missionary organizations that were actually fronts for criminal enterprises designed to steal from faithful Christians who trusted her spiritual authenticity and commitment to helping others. But Oprah's commitment to protecting America's Christian community never wavered, despite the enormous personal risks involved in challenging a criminal organization that had demonstrated its willingness to exploit the most sacred aspects of faith and spiritual devotion. She had built her career on values of spiritual authenticity, personal growth, and protecting those who needed help, and discovering that her own spiritual reputation was being used to steal from faithful Christians only strengthened her determination to expose the entire religious fraud network, regardless of the personal cost to her career and spiritual credibility. The trap was set when the religious fraud network decided to eliminate Oprah as a threat to their operations by destroying her reputation within the very faith community she was trying to protect. Criminal organizations had become increasingly concerned about Oprah's investigation and her influence within Christian circles. Recognizing that her credibility and spiritual authenticity posed an existential threat to their ability to continue exploiting faithful Americans. Working with corrupt religious leaders and using falsified financial evidence, they orchestrated a comprehensive investigation designed to frame Oprah as exactly the type of religious criminal she had been working to expose. What the religious fraud network didn't realize was that Oprah's investigation team had been monitoring their activities for over 2 years, using surveillance methods that exceeded anything available to traditional law enforcement agencies, that were often reluctant to investigate religious organizations due to constitutional protections surrounding freedom of religion. They had documented meetings between fraud coordinators and corrupt religious leaders, recorded conversations about targeting specific churches and faithful individuals, and traced the flow of stolen religious donations through the network's money laundering operations that often involved legitimate-appearing Christian organizations. They had comprehensive evidence of the criminal enterprise and were prepared to present documentation that would expose not just individual crimes, but the entire system of corruption that had enabled systematic theft from America's most faithful citizens. The fabricated case against Oprah was sophisticated and appeared to be supported by overwhelming evidence of exactly the type of religious fraud she had been working to expose. Financial records showing suspicious religious donation transactions, testimony from alleged church leaders claiming Oprah had stolen their congregational giving, and expert analysis suggesting systematic exploitation of Christian generosity all painted a picture of celebrity-enabled religious fraud. The criminal network had spent over 18 months building the case, convinced that destroying Oprah's spiritual reputation would eliminate the greatest threat their religious fraud empire had ever faced, while simultaneously discrediting the entire concept of investigating religious crime. But Oprah's legal team was prepared for the criminal network's attack on her spiritual integrity and professional reputation. Led by former federal prosecutor and ordained minister Reverend Dr. Sarah Johnson, one of the most experienced religious fraud defense attorneys in the country, they had spent months preparing for the moment when the fraud network would try to neutralize Oprah's investigation by destroying her credibility within the Christian community. They had compiled comprehensive evidence of the real religious fraud scheme and were ready to present documentation that would expose the true criminals while vindicating Oprah's efforts to protect America's faithful population from spiritual and financial exploitation. On the morning when Detective Sullivan announced Oprah's arrest at a packed press conference outside Holy Trinity Baptist Church, he stood before the assembled media and congregation convinced that he was protecting America's Christians from celebrity religious exploitation, having no idea that he was actually providing cover for the real criminals who had been systematically stealing from faithful Americans for years while hiding behind religious language and biblical references. The press conference was attended by denominational leaders, Christian media representatives, and faithful congregations who believed they were witnessing the exposure of religious fraud, not realizing they were watching the climax of the criminals' efforts to silence their most effective opponent. "Ladies and gentlemen," Detective Sullivan announced to the crowd of reporters, television cameras, and faithful church members, his voice carrying the moral authority of someone who believed he was defending Christian values from celebrity corruption. "Today, we've arrested someone who betrayed the trust of America's most faithful citizens in the most despicable way possible. Oprah Winfrey used her spiritual reputation and the love that Christian Americans felt for her journey of faith to steal from churches, exploit religious generosity, and destroy the sacred trust that exists between believers and those who claim to serve God's work. This case proves that we will pursue anyone who preys on people of faith, regardless of their celebrity status or spiritual reputation." But federal agents were coordinating with Oprah's legal team to prepare for the most dramatic reversal in religious fraud history. Reverend Dr. Johnson had been providing prosecutors with comprehensive evidence from Oprah's investigation that would expose the largest systematic theft from American Christians ever documented. The reversal came exactly 108 hours later, when federal agents conducted coordinated raids across 15 states, arresting 63 individuals in the religious fraud network, including fake evangelists, corrupt officials, and criminal coordinators. The evidence recovered over $1.2 billion stolen from faithful Americans. As the real criminals were arrested, Oprah finally spoke publicly about her spiritual mission. For nearly 3 years, I've watched criminals destroy the faith and financial security of God's people, she said. They used my name to exploit faithful Americans who gave sacrificially, believing they were supporting God's work. Today, we restore that trust. Within 4 weeks, federal investigations returned stolen donations to over 127,000 victimized Americans, restored funding to legitimate Christian ministries, and implemented new oversight measures to prevent future exploitation of religious generosity. The investigation resulted in 84 convictions with sentences up to life imprisonment. Oprah's courage in fighting for America's Christian community created the most significant reform of religious oversight in federal history, protecting millions of faithful Americans from criminal exploitation disguised as ministry.